They say history is written by the victors. But what if the victors, for once, were not Romans, but the very people Rome once called barbarians? Tonight, let me take you back 2,000 years into the misty, uncharted forests of Germania, dense, cold, and alive with whispers of forgotten gods, where thunder rolled through the trees like drums of war, and men painted their faces before battle. It was a land Rome feared not because of its armies, but because it refused to kneel. And somewhere, in that wild world, a child was born. His name was Arminius. He wasn't meant to be remembered. He wasn't born in marble halls or under golden ceilings. He was born in a wooden hut, under a sky filled with smoke from campfires. His father, Segimer, was a chieftain proud, loyal, and brave. But loyalty had a price, especially when Rome was involved. Because by the time Arminius could walk, Rome had already come. They crossed the Rhine, shining helmets, red cloaks, the rhythm of their sandals echoing across the land. They came not as guests, but as gods. And the tribes one by one bowed. They called it peace. But it was not peace. It was a silent surrender. When Arminius was barely 10, Rome took him as a hostage of honor. That's what they called it. But it was a gilded cage. A political chain disguised as generosity. He was shipped away from his homeland, across rivers, across mountains, into the beating heart of an empire that would one day regret ever teaching him its secrets. In Rome, Arminius saw a world unlike anything he knew. Marble palaces, public baths, statues so lifelike, they seemed to breathe. And everywhere, the sound of discipline, the sound of empire. They taught him Latin. They trained him in Roman warfare. They gave him a Roman name. And slowly, the barbarian boy became a Roman soldier. He learned to think like them, to fight like them, even to speak like them. But deep inside, the fire of Germania, that wild, ancient spirit never died. Years later, when he stood among the ranks of the Roman army, armor gleaming, sword raised, his superiors praised him. They said, "This one, he's different. He's loyal. He's Roman in heart." But what they couldn't see was that the same hands trained to defend Rome were quietly learning how to destroy it. Because every day Arminius marched beside them, he studied them, their tactics, their weaknesses, their arrogance. And arrogance was Rome's favorite weapon and its greatest flaw. For Rome believed no one could defeat them. They believed their gods favored them. They believed the forests of Germania would one day bow like the deserts of Egypt, like the cities of Greece.
But in the shadows of that belief, one man was waiting, watching, learning, and he was biding his time. Years later, Rome sent Arminius back to Germania, not as a prisoner, but as a commander, a Roman knight, a hero. He was to assist the Roman governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus, in managing the province. To keep peace among the tribes, Varus trusted him. Everyone did. Arminius dined at his table, rode beside him, called him friend. But that word, friend, was about to become the sharpest dagger in Roman history, because Arminius had seen enough of Roman peace to know what it really meant: taxes, humiliation, execution. For every Roman banner raised, a village burned. For every Roman feast, a family starved. And every German child learned to fear the men in red cloaks. One night, as the fires of the Roman camp flickered against the trees, Arminius stood alone at the edge of the forest. He could hear wolves howling in the distance, wild and free, and in that sound, he remembered home, the scent of wet earth, the laughter of his people, the songs they sang before Rome came. That night, something inside him broke. He whispered to himself, in the old tongue, "No empire lasts forever." It was the first time in years he had spoken his native words, and it felt like fire in his chest. The next day, he smiled as if nothing had changed. He rode beside Varus, calm and loyal as ever. But the truth was already moving through the forests, like wind before a storm. Messengers, chieftains, secret oaths, the tribes who once hated each other, now began to listen. They gathered in silence. Old enemies sat across the same fires. They had all suffered, and now, they had a leader, one who knew Rome better than Rome knew itself, Arminius, the wolf who had lived among the lions. But Rome had no idea. They believed they had tamed the tribes. They believed Arminius was theirs. And as Varus prepared to march deeper into Germania that autumn, confident and proud, the young general smiled quietly to himself, because he knew that journey would be Varus's last. The storm was coming. and the forests were ready to remember. The year was 09 AD. Rome stood at the height of its power, the greatest empire the world had ever known. From the deserts of Africa to the icy rivers of Germania, the eagle banners stretched far and wide. To the Romans, Germania was a frontier, wild and tamed, a wound that refused to heal. But to the tribes who lived there, it was home, sacred, alive. And now, deep in that sacred wilderness, a trap was being laid. Arminius walked between two worlds, Rome and Germania. To the Romans, he was their loyal commander. To the tribes, he was a son returned from the dead. But he knew one thing: he could never belong to both. When Varus arrived in Germania, he was no soldier of instinct. He was a bureaucrat, a man of law, not of war. He had governed peaceful provinces before, where Roman order ruled by decree and pen. But Germania was not a land to be ruled by scrolls and seals. The tribes didn't understand Roman taxes or decrees. They understood loyalty and blood. Varus didn't see that. To him, they were savages. To Arminius, they were brothers. Arminius had earned Varus's complete trust. He advised him on local politics, led patrols, and interpreted tribal messages. And slowly, carefully, he began to weave a story, a false one. He told Varus of a tribal uprising to the north. He spoke with urgency, with conviction. The tribes are restless, governor. They speak of rebellion. If we march now, we can crush it before it spreads. Varus, blind with pride, believed him. He assembled 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, nearly 20,000 men, veterans of campaigns, armed with steel and arrogance. They carried with them not just weapons, but families, slaves, and supplies, for they were sure it would be an easy march. And all the while, Arminius led them, smiling, patient, every step drawing them deeper into his homeland. The land he once walked barefoot as a child now became the stage of his vengeance. As the legions moved forward, the terrain began to change. The roads disappeared. The sky darkened under heavy clouds. The forest grew thicker, damp with rain and shadows. Roman formation, that perfect symbol of discipline, began to break. But Varus trusted his guide. He trusted Arminius. The soldiers joked. They sang. They believed they were marching to glory. Only one man suspected something: Segist, another German noble, and Arminius's own father-in-law. He warned Varus, "Do not trust him. Arminius has betrayed Rome. He gathers tribes in secret." But Varus laughed. He couldn't believe it. Arminius, his friend, his officer, a traitor? Impossible. He waved the warning aside. Arminius stood before Varus that evening, calm and composed. He promised to ride ahead to gather allied tribes. Varus nodded, and as Arminius mounted his horse, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, drenching the earth. When he disappeared into the trees, Varus never saw him again. The next morning, thunder rolled across the forest, not the sound of storm clouds, but the war cries of thousands. It began suddenly, chaos from every direction. Arrows rained from the treetops, spears flew out of the fog, and the forest erupted with fury. Men screamed, horses reared, Roman shields clashed as soldiers scrambled into formation. But the ground was slick with mud, and the trees too close for order. The legions tried to fight back, but they were trapped. They couldn't see their enemy, only shadows moving between trees. The forest itself seemed alive, fighting against them, and at its heart was Arminius. He rode among the tribes, his face streaked with rain and blood. He shouted in his native tongue, "Now, for Germania, for freedom." For 3 days, the Romans fought. They cut down trees, built barricades, tried to regroup, but the forest swallowed them again and again. Every time they rested, more tribes joined the ambush. Men, women, even children. The rain turned the ground into a swamp. Their food rotted. Their morale collapsed. Varus tried to stay calm, but fear had already taken hold. He couldn't understand how his trusted friend could do this. He couldn't understand why the gods had abandoned him. On the 3rd night, wounded and broken, the Romans tried to flee, but every path led deeper into the trap. Every hill they climbed revealed only more forest, more death. And then, they saw him, Arminius. He stood on a ridge, holding a Roman standard high, one he had captured. It was the eagle of Rome, dripping with rain and blood, and behind him stood the tribes, roaring his name, Arminius, Arminius. Varus knew it was over. The mighty legions that once conquered half the world were now corpses scattered in the mud. According to the historians, when Varus saw defeat closing in, he took his own life. He fell on his sword, unable to face the shame of losing to those he once called barbarians. When it ended, the forest was silent. Only the crows remained. 20,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, their armor rusting in the rain, their banners torn. their empire humiliated, Arminius walked among the fallen, his face expressionless. The man Rome had raised as one of its own had just destroyed an entire Roman army. The impossible had happened. The invincible empire, defeated by its own creation.
He stood there, in the heart of the forest, staring at the horizon. Some say he whispered one word, freedom. Others say he said nothing at all. But whatever he felt in that moment, the world would never be the same again. For Rome, it was more than a defeat. It was a wound, deep and unforgettable. And across the Rhine, Emperor Augustus himself, upon hearing the news, tore his robes and cried out, "Varus, give me back my legions." But the legions would never return. The 17th, 18th, and 19th, their numbers were erased from Roman records forever. Rome wanted to forget them, but history remembered. And as for Arminius, his victory made him a legend among the tribes, but also a target, because the moment one enemy falls, another always rises, and soon, Arminius would learn that the greatest betrayal doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from those closest to you.
Victory. For most men, it's the end of the struggle. But for Arminius, it was only the beginning. The forests of Teutoburg were silent now. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of blood and smoke. Crows circled above the fallen, feasting on the remains of the mightiest army Rome had ever sent across the Rhine. The tribes rejoiced. Songs were sung. Fires were lit across the valleys. For the first time in living memory, Germania was free. But freedom, as history has always shown, is never simple. For the Roman boy who became a German hero, this victory carried a shadow. He had crushed the empire that raised him, defeated the gods of his captors, and become the symbol of rebellion. But with that power came something even more dangerous than Rome itself: envy. In the months that followed the battle, the tribes celebrated Arminius like a god. They brought him gifts, food, slaves. His name was spoken with awe. Yet not everyone saw him as a savior. Many tribal leaders began to whisper, "Has Arminius defeated Rome only to rule us like Rome did?" Among those whispers was one man who hated him most, Augustus, his own father-in-law, the same man who had once warned Varus not to trust him. Augustus had once been Rome's ally. He believed in peace through obedience. And now, he saw Arminius not as a liberator, but as a dangerous dreamer. At home, things grew worse. Arminius's wife, the Snelda, Augustus's daughter, had stood by her husband through everything. She was proud, strong, and loyal. But loyalty had a cost.
Rome had not forgotten the massacre. They sent word across the empire, capture Arminius at all costs. And so, in secret, Augustus betrayed his own blood. He delivered the Snelda, his daughter and Arminius's wife, to the Romans as a prisoner, a gift to Emperor Tiberius himself. When Arminius learned what had happened, something inside him shattered. The man who had outwitted the world's greatest empire was powerless to save the woman he loved. He rode day and night, searching for her, but by the time he reached the river, the Roman ship was already gone, carrying the Snelda away, her eyes never turning back. Some say she was pregnant with Arminius's child. Some say she gave birth in captivity, raising their son in chains under the shadow of Rome. No one truly knows. But that day, as Arminius stood on the riverbank, drenched in rain and grief, the forest around him seemed to mourn, for even the gods of Germania could not save him from fate. His victory had brought pride to his people, but it had also brought Rome's eternal wrath. Emperor Tiberius, cold and calculating, did not rush into revenge. He was wiser than Augustus. He knew the forest would devour any army foolish enough to chase ghosts, so he sent his best generals, Germanicus among them, to humiliate Arminius not through conquest, but through terror. They burned villages, slaughtered innocents, and desecrated the battlefield at Teutoburg, raising the skulls of dead Romans from the mud and reburying them under marble shrines, as if reclaiming honor from ashes. Germanicus even found the bones of Varus. He buried him with Roman rites, and vowed to bring back Arminius's head as tribute to the gods. But Arminius was no longer the same man. He had become a ghost, hunted, restless, bitter. Each night, he walked among the trees, whispering to the spirits of the fallen. He felt their eyes watching him, the dead Romans, the lost Germans, his wife. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear her voice, soft, distant, almost unreal. "You freed a nation, but lost yourself." He gathered what was left of the tribes, urging them to fight again. But this time, their unity was fading. Greed, pride, and fear returned like rot beneath the bark of a great tree. One chieftain after another began to withdraw support. Some sought peace with Rome, others wanted to rule their own valleys, their own people, and so, the great alliance that once defied an empire began to crumble. Arminius tried to hold them together. He spoke to them with fire in his voice. Rome may come again. They always come again. If we do not stand as one, our children will live as slaves. But his words fell on tired hearts. Too many had already buried sons in the forest. Too many feared the eagle banners that still glimmered across the Rhine. One night, as the mist rolled in over the rivers, Arminius met his old comrade, Flavus, his own brother, who had remained loyal to Rome. The two stood on opposite sides of the riverbank, the line between worlds.
They shouted across the water, words filled with anger and pain. "Brother," Flavus cried, "you fight a lost cause. Rome cannot be beaten forever. Join us again. The emperor would forgive." Arminius shook his head, his voice breaking with fury. "Forgive? Rome does not forgive. It enslaves. It kills. You still wear their chains, brother. I broke mine." Flavus pointed his sword toward him. "Then you will die for your pride. And you," Arminius answered, "will live without your soul." The river carried their echoes into the night. Two brothers, two paths, both shaped by Rome. In the years that followed, Arminius's rebellion began to fade. The Romans stopped chasing him, content to hold their border. They built massive fortifications along the Rhine, walls that said, "Here ends Rome, and begins the world." And within that world, Arminius grew older. He was still feared, still respected, but something in his eyes had changed. The fire was dimmer, the laughter gone. He had freed a land, but not a people. Because freedom, without unity, is only an illusion. His once loyal warriors now whispered in the dark. Some said he had become too powerful. Others said the gods had turned against him. A few even claimed that Arminius was becoming what he once destroyed, a ruler drunk on his own legend. And as history has always proven, when power grows, so does betrayal. One evening, as the sun bled red through the trees, Arminius gathered his council, men he had fought beside for years, men who once swore to die for him. They spoke of Rome, of the future, of leadership, but behind their words lay poison. That night, when the fires went out, Arminius's own men turned on him, knives in the dark, whispers, the sound of a struggle. When it was over, the man who had destroyed legions, who had defied an empire, who had been both barbarian and Roman, lay dying in the forest he once ruled. They say he looked up to the sky one last time. The wind brushed through the trees, like the whisper of his homeland, and with his final breath, he murmured, "Tell my son, I was free." Then silence. The same forest that had hidden him now became his grave. But even in death, his shadow lingered. The Romans never forgot him. The Germans never agreed about him. Some called him a savior, others a traitor. But every empire, in its final days, remembers the one who showed it could bleed. And centuries later, when Rome itself fell, some said, the echo of its fall began the day one man in a forest dared to say no. Yet there was one more twist, a truth history buried deep, beneath pride and propaganda. Because Rome may have lost the battle, but the war for memory, was still to come.
They say time buries all things, kingdoms, empires, even the names of men. But some names refuse to die. They linger, not in marble, not in books, but in whispers carried by the wind. Arminius was gone. His body, they say, was left in breed, torn apart by those who once swore loyalty to him. The forest that had once echoed with his victory now held only silence. And yet, that silence was not defeat. It was the sound of something greater, something Rome could never conquer. Word of his death reached the Roman fortresses across the Rhine. The generals read the reports, but there was no celebration. They did not cheer. They did not laugh. Because even in death, Arminius haunted them. They remembered Teutoburg. They remembered the mud, the screams, the vanished legions. They remembered that a single man, born a barbarian, trained by Rome, had broken the illusion of their invincibility. The empire learned to fear the forest. They drew their borders and never again tried to cross them. For more than 4 centuries, Germania remained untamed, but what Rome could not defeat with swords, it slowly destroyed with time, trade, politics, influence. One by one, the tribes turned inward. The unity Arminius had dreamed of faded into dust. Generations passed. Rome itself began to rot, not from enemies outside, but from arrogance within. The same arrogance Arminius had seen, the same blindness Varus had carried into the woods, now spread like disease through the Senate halls. Luxury replaced discipline, greed replaced faith, and the gods they once believed in, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, turned to stone in silence. When the empire finally fell, centuries later, no Roman general ever realized. Its first real crack had begun the day Arminius rose in those dark German woods, because every empire that believes it cannot fall already has. The centuries turned, and the world forgot his face. The chronicles written by Romans called him a traitor. Their poets mocked him as a barbarian who turned against his masters. They never spoke of why he turned, of the villages burned, of the chains, of the women sold as slaves. No, history is always written from the throne. But somewhere, deep in the heart of the old forests, the people remembered. They told stories to their children, of the warrior who knew Rome's secrets, of the boy who was taken, taught, and returned as a storm. They called him Herman the Liberator. His name changed over the ages, from Arminius to Herman, but his spirit never changed. When Rome's ruins turned to dust, and the tribes of Germania became nations, they began to look back. They searched for a symbol, not of power, but of defiance. And they found him, waiting in the fog of memory. In the 19th century, long after the Roman Empire was gone, Germany itself rose as a new empire, and once again, Arminius was reborn in marble. Statues were raised in his honor. The most famous one, the Hermann's Denkmal, still stands tall today, towering over the Teutoburg Forest, his sword raised high toward the sky, forever facing west, toward Rome. But if you look closer, really closer, you'll see something strange. His face isn't triumphant, it isn't proud, it's sorrowful, almost haunted, because deep down, the sculptors knew what history forgot. Freedom built on blood is never peace, and Arminius, for all his victory, lost everything he ever loved.